In his novel Deux grands hommes et demi, the Malian writer Diadier Dembélé takes us on a journey that is both intimate and universal. Through the intertwined destinies of two friends, he portrays the contemporary tragedies of exile, climate change, and social decline. Today we have the pleasure of talking to him about the inspiration behind his characters, the realities of migration, and his commitment to migrants. Take a look.
Diadier Dembélé, thank you for joining us on Initiative Africa. You are the author of the novel 2.5 Great Men, which shines the light on the journey of two Malian friends migrating to France in the 80s and 90s. How did you come up with the idea of these two characters?
Hello, thank you for the question. The idea was born from the previous novel called The Duel of Grandmothers. In this novel there was a character, the narrator's father Kaba, who works in a distant country. This is how the narrator tried to explain his father's work when asked, "What did your father do?" I partially created Mancha and Toko, inspired from those characters and feedback from readers. But also from the outset, my ambition was to tell a story spanning 3 generations. So there was the grandfather who lived under colonial rule, then the father who arrived in France, then the son who follows in his father's footsteps tells this story. But then I realized that it was almost a family saga spanning several volumes. So really, it is from this that I created the first character, Toko, who came to France and worked. But I realized he had a smooth character. He followed the rules, he obeyed. Therefore, everything went almost too well. It was then that I started to develop the character of Mancha, a bit of a rebel who does whatever he likes, who listens to no one, and who is very fiery. And from that point, this friendship became almost a bond, a sort of duo, a yin and yang between the two.
Before discussing immigration towards Europe, isn't your work firstly a novel about the inevitable exile of many of these young people forced to leave their villages due to poor harvests? Is this the reason for their departure?
Le départ commence effectivement sur...
The departure is influenced by the overall conditions, particularly the presence of drought.
Il y a surtout d'autres choses dans le roman qui ne sont pas explicitement dites.
The novel implies a sense of social decline, stemming from Mancha's father's sudden impoverishment and transition to farming.
La bonne fortune et qui tout à coup se retrouvait appauvri, donc a été obligé de devenir cultivateur. Donc la sécheresse fresque.
The drought exacerbates this feeling of decline, leading to rural exodus as the only viable solution. It's important to note that the final destination wasn't necessarily Europe.
N'était pas nécessairement l'Europe. Ça a été l'Europe à un moment donné par des choix.
While some choose Europe due to personal reasons and political context, most initially moved to nearby large cities to work as seasonal laborers during the dry season, with the intention of saving money to return to village. However, things rarely went as planned, leading to the development of an alternative migration route that could take them far from their home country.
De migration qui peuvent les amener loin de leur pays d'origine.
You speak about social decline, but it is clear that family and tradition quickly become more important in the lives of these two friends, ultimately depriving them of their free will. This trap that closes on them, is it still perceptible today?
Alors, précisément au Mali, il y a encore une...
In Mali, there is still a strong sense of conservatism, where the head of the family makes decisions for everyone. In Mancha's situation, his father is the head of the family and makes decisions for him and the other family members.
Donc, il va lui imposer un choix.
Mancha has no choice but to comply with his father's decision, as there is a belief in the curse of disobeying one's parents. A child must always obey, regardless of the request or constraint, and should never say no.
Quelle que soit la contrainte, n'est jamais dire non. Parce qu'à partir du moment où on dit non, donc
saying no can break a taboo and make someone seem unapproachable. This fear of being perceived as the cursed child or the unsubmissive woman, particularly for women, can lead people to accept decisions to the point where it ultimately becomes unbearable for them.
Finalement, ça devient insupportable pour eux.
What is striking about their arrival in Paris is the silence around their situation. They sleep in a hallway of a slum in the suburbs of Paris, but they must not tell their relatives, not to worry them. What should we think of this tacit silence, which continues to this day?
Yeah, it still exists, it's still present, but I think it's primarily about dignity other than philosophical or sociological considerations. In fact, when is it that I'm considered to be unworthy as a human being? As I go through a difficult ordeal, a challenge, a situation that is hard to endure. At the moment, a man starts complaining about his situation, telling the reality of what he's going through. He may be perceived as unworthy or simply as a coward. So in such cases, he prefers not to lie, but to omit necessary information. And it was unfortunately very common. We used to write letters like official correspondence with set phrases to convey new and reassure. However, nothing was ever said about the police pressure at that time, the insalubrious living condition or the difficult working conditions. Sometimes, when someone had been out of work for 6 months but had all their documents in order and needed to travel to their village, others would pitch in to pay for their travel tickets and give them money for groceries. The person would then go to their home village and everything would usually go smoothly. However, no one really knew what was happening on the other side. So it's more a matter of pride and perception of dignity in this case, I think.
Diadier Dembélé, your novel 2.5 Great Men is set in the 80s and 90s. Would it be translated and published in Africa? And how do you think it will be perceived by a young Malian today?
I think and hope that the novel will be translated and published in French, either in Mali or neighboring French-speaking countries such as Senegal or Côte d'Ivoire. These are ongoing topics of discussion with the publisher and are therefore possible. Since June 2023, all 13 national languages, with Bambara being the most spoken, have become the official languages. I hope that one day I will be able to translate this novel into Bambara, which is widely spoken in Mali and almost the national language in our culture. Regarding the perception of young people about this novel, I think that today what may have changed is that in the 80s or the 90s, there was a certain ambiguity about what was actually happening in France. There were no images, there was no television. Therefore, young people were unaware. They thought it was an El Dorado. Because inevitably, when adventurers, as we call them, return to the country, they appear to be living in a luxurious life with plenty of money. It was a party. We did not know under what condition they had acquired that money or in what circumstances they lived. But today, we have access to this information. So young people view it with less of a dreamlike perspective. However, given the situation of the country and the overall situation in West Africa, this does not dissuade some young people from taking the journey. It does not deter them because there is also a form of heroization, if I may put it that way. I would say that if someone is capable today of crossing the desert, taking boats, arriving in Europe and succeeding, that person is a hero. Therefore, this naturally encourages some to follow in the footsteps of their elders. As for the novel, or the opinion of those who will read it, or have views on the matter, I cannot say too much because it will depend on each person's perspective and understanding of the world.
You have worked in a migrant support charity. Could you please tell us about that work?
Yes, I worked there for 2.5 years. The target audience primarily consisted of asylum seekers from West Africa and accompanied minors, and individuals already in a regular situation who approached the French administration. I was involved with 2 languages, Soninké and Bambara, spoken in Senegal, Mali, Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Guinea, etc.
Donc c'était des gens originaires de ces pays-là.
There were people from this country who required translation, which I provided.
Qui avaient besoin des traductions que je faisais.
What have you noticed about these newcomers? In their psychological state, in their expectations, in their concerns?
There was always a sense of resilience, as most of those who arrived in 2019-2020 came from Morocco or Libya. There was a feeling of relief, but also concern about what would happen next. Regarding asylum requests, unfortunately for those coming from Mali, there were very few favorable responses, even for specific situations, such as the issues of slavery or excisions, etc. Some people have found that the French ask many questions, perhaps even too many. At a certain point, it becomes exhausting to have to repeat the same things over and over again. It seems as if by repeating a truth, it remains a truth and does not disperse when, in reality, this is not the case. People know that what they have experienced is true. They don't understand the need that exists among social workers to ask them to tell their story every time, to be assessed and graded, and at the same time to be expected to keep their emotions intact, while trying not to cry, to burst into tears when they tell the story of crossing, the people they saw die, or the people beaten by the smugglers, or those who were imprisoned in Libya, and that really moved me.
You mentioned a general pessimism in France regarding the fight against anti-immigration legislation. In your opinion, what can Africans, whether at the state or civil society level, contribute to this debate? Currently, the debate seems to be mainly centered on the West, Europe, and Europeans.
I think that the states can contribute behind what has already been done, which consists of awareness campaigns to tell people not to leave. Concretely, what I mean is linked to politics. But it is up to the states to show that, whatever the nature, the regular or irregular status of the nationals of their country, they remain citizens of their country. Why do African states allow their citizens to endure deathful experiences without taking action? In fact, I would wish for there to be at least some designated offices in embassies, in consulates, in various European or Maghreb countries that could provide at least basic assistance to those nationals who wish to wait to arrive in Europe or are already there. Therefore, I believe that the states can offer more support in this regard. Regarding African civil society, I believe they should try to establish platforms to communicate about the collaboration that exists between twin cities in Africa and towns in France. Cooperations that have enabled certain villages to have water towers, water supply systems, schools, and healthcare centers. And all of this is financed by both the immigrants in France, by grants from regions and municipalities, and also by the governments. And on the other hand, civil society in Africa, particularly in Mali, should understand that people who go to work abroad have their own expenses to manage. Therefore, the little money they can save and send back should not only be used to cover regular expenses, but could also be invested, and why not help these immigrants establish small businesses. I believe that the involvement of civil society, along with an awareness of the various aspects of the immigration issue, will both highlight the benefits for Europeans and Africans, and also provide a long-term solution for those voluntary return of immigrants who are either not legally integrated or who are already but aspire to return to their home country.